Hey, welcome, Juan. And Juan Argil from Mexico, tell us a little bit about your journey and how you ended up here and in art and comics and illustration.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Mexicali, Baja California, which is a border town in Mexico. And I kind of moved all over the place in Mexico. I ended up living most of it in Guadalajara though. And eventually my mom got in a wheelchair accident and we ended up moving to this for multiple reasons, but like it's just easier to live in the States in those circumstances. Just there's more handicap stuff and everything. And we just kind of were in Arizona for a while, and then I came here for college to CCAD, and just kind of ended up crashing here in Columbus. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's great. I love that you're here in Columbus because we've gotten to know each other and we're collaborating on a piece together. When did you start, really becoming interested in storytelling through drawing, or kind of shaping or taking the world and reshaping it through illustration?
Well, I initially wanted to be fine arts. Initially, it was just like a high school credit. And then I got really interested in fine arts, but while I was going through my art program, I kind of realized that I consumed a lot more of mainstream media, films, comics, and stuff like that. So I kind of thought that it might be a better way to reach people, to utilize more of a mainstream format than sculpture or things like that.
You know, there is a big difference, a lot of people may not know this, between telling a story in sequence and telling a story or flashing a story in a single image.
Yeah.
So maybe you can walk us a little bit through that, and then I want to talk about your pieces here and other work that you're doing.
Yeah, that was definitely a challenge starting in comics. My background is in illustration and painting, so it was definitely a challenge to kind of figure out what are the best places to put it, because even though if you like animation and film, comics is just kind of like you don't draw the entire sequence. It's kind of like essentializing it in just a way that sells everything. Comics are definitely a very challenging medium, but I feel like you can tell a lot of different stories that way. And it's just been a lot of fun to kind of experiment and like go with like the traditional form, but also like let my background in other fields kind of dictate how I approach it, like when it comes to breaking rules or not.
Are there any big kind of influences, people that you looked up to that when you were like, wow, how did they do it, and can I do this and surpass this?
Yeah, I think definitely growing up a lot of manga or anime, like in Mexico, it's just common to have like Dragon Ball, Ranma 1/2, Caballeros del Zodiaco, or stuff like that, just like on TV, like it was just in Canal 5. So it was never like that foreign to me or anything. And so I'd say I definitely knew more of Japanese comics and animation than American. It isn't really until I started getting more interested in doing comics while I was in college that I got really interested in works by people like Chris Ware, serialized comics like Bill Watterson's and stuff like that. Mafalda was a pretty good influence in high school. And yeah, so I kind of let my influence be like kind of all over the place. Like I also really like basing things on film or fine art or different stuff.
So, Juan, walk us through your piece on the left here. Tell us a little bit about the inspiration and the process from kind of idea to page to drawing to inking to coloring.
Sure, absolutely. The painting on the left is, it was originally for a fine art versus comics gallery show. And the idea was to kind of juxtapose like the comic format with traditional paintings, and I really like Hieronymus Bosch's like the triptych.
The Garden of Earthly Delights?
The Hayward triptych. It's the one where it's kind of about the world ending and Armageddon, and like how like the closer you get to that. Well, there's multiple interpretations, but the one I kind of infatuated on is that like the closer the world was to ending, the more people clung to sin or to deviousness. And I thought it'd be interesting to recontextualize the religious aspect to climate change and like our current Armageddon in a way, and how people have been clinging more to denying it and to not engage with it the closer we've gotten to a climate catastrophe. So I just kind of wanted to create a parallel between those two things with that painting.
You have paneling here at the same time that it feels like it's a complete page, right? Right? It's almost illustration and comics combined.
Yeah, like I said, I really like kind of showing all backgrounds, and also like I still wanted to respect the original painting, so I kind of wanted to create segments of it that emulate the original painting while also adding some comics element to maybe like add and furthering the narrative in a more interesting way, in a more dynamic way.
Do you have a kind of almost like a trademark color palette? I feel like your colors, or does every project determine different colors?
It's definitely not as intentional as it looks sometimes. I've noticed that I tend to gravitate more towards warmer, bright colors rather than using like value or like a specific palette. And I think a part of it is from watching cartoons. It seems like there's so much about bright colors, like an outline, and also I've been told by a lot of people that my palette kind of ends up looking like a lot of like Mexican culture, like like Aztec, Mayan, or like our traditional stuff where it's like a lot of earth tones and colors that kind of go around that spectrum. But it's definitely a more subconscious thing that kind of developed as I made art through the years. It wasn't necessarily that I was like, oh, I'm gonna paint or draw this way. It just kind of organically happened.
Really beautiful, and also just goes to show you that even in that sort of lower half of the page where we have almost like the kind of illustration art at work, that even something like that without the panels dividing time and space, you still have a sequence and a story that's happening, that's unfolding.
Yeah, so a lot of the narrative kind of came out of necessity. Ideally, I would have wanted this to be a comic, but the idea surfaced from my mother, who is in a wheelchair. She's been in a wheelchair since I was like in 5th grade. And something that we always talk about is how like during Halloween or times like that where you have to pick like a costume or a hero, like she's like, I don't really know what to dress up as. Like there really isn't a lot of wheelchair characters in media that aren't like the rich CEO that is like evil, and like it's kind of supposed to show deviousness almost through them being in a wheelchair, like a shortcoming or something. So I kind of wanted to create like a more positive representation of that. So I thought it'd be cool to do a wheelchair character for that, and it's my first time designing a superhero, so it was definitely a challenge. It's not something I'm very used to, but I decided to make her. Her name is Mooncycle. And the concept behind it is that she doesn't need to get off her wheelchair to do anything. She has the ability to move objects and of super strength and just to levitate things, like herself on her wheelchair or different things. And a lot of this was designed with a back and forth with my mom, like asking her, like, hey, what would you like in a superhero? Like, what would you like to see? And one thing that she said that really stood out to me was that she didn't want her to like do the normal superhero stuff to everyone. She kind of wanted the wheelchair person to focus for fighting for handicapped people, people with special needs, and just through their justice, through their daily struggles, or through like activism or different things, and just to be an advocate for them.
Yeah, I love it. And of course, you've got a brown woman, a Latina, and there's a boy here who's clearly who's suffered some disability, and then this powerful kind of lifting of the car.
Yeah, yeah, that was definitely inspired of the classic cover thing where like Superman punches the car and stuff like that. I just thought that was like very classic imagery, so I kind of wanted to emulate it, but more in her way. And I really wanted to, for example, in the angle, you can see that it's like a lower angle because I think, like in cinematic language and different stuff, it kind of shows that like the angle really tells like a power dynamic, and I felt like a low angle for her would like kind of like make her feel grand or like more important than the normal angle that you see in a lot of comics, where it's more about like, it's a height thing.
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah, that kind of worm's eye view that gets a certain power to the figure. Right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, beautifully too, a really subtle but beautiful and important element of your drawing is the architecture.
Yeah.
The buildings.
Yeah, that's inspired of, I grew up in most of my life in Guadalajara, and I really wanted to draw a place in Mexico that isn't like the desert with like the tar house kind of thing that you're used to seeing, and just showing like more like, yeah, there's modernity, but like you can still have like architecture that resembles Mexican culture without it having to be like in the normal spaces that you see it, just like in a more metropolitan setting.
I love it, and of course the wheelchair, sort of high-tech wheelchair, even almost puts it in a kind of Latinx futurist frame, right?
Yeah, that's really funny actually, because that's actually inspired of a wheelchair that's currently a thing. Japan has a company where like they've been trying to kind of push like creating more sophisticated, like aesthetically pleasing chairs for people in wheelchairs, so like they can go to businesses and things like that, and just like kind of like present themselves as more of like a, wow, this is like a really cool wheelchair, rather than focusing on the fact that it's a wheelchair. You're more like, wow, this is really dope. I wish I could just sit on it and like just be in it. Like, so I really like that kind of philosophy that they have, and I wanted to put her in like a fancy wheelchair for the.
Yeah, that's true. I never thought about that. Like, why don't we have like Lamborghini?
Yeah.
Wheelchairs, right?
Yeah, and when I was doing research, you see that a lot too. Like a lot of like costumes that you do see people do for kids and stuff like that. Like they kind of focus on that, like decking out the wheelchair, like making it a boat or like a cool object that like kind of like drags attention and makes it more of like a, wow, this is really cool.
I love that. So Juan, as we wrap this up, I was hoping you could talk just very briefly about another project that you're doing, Labyrinths Borne. It's set in the future, speaking of Latinx futurism, and it's been a kind of a passion of yours for a little while, co-creating with me. But can you tell us a little bit about that and kind of the process? It's very exciting.
Yeah.
Story and the process.
Yeah, it's been very interesting. It's my first time illustrating someone else's story. I've generally been very self-published, do it yourself, and it's been really interesting to kind of put someone else's vision on a page, and especially with these kind of themes that are like just very sophisticated, and it's definitely been almost like a school lesson. Like I feel like every time I work on it, like there's a reference to a concept of philosophy or thought that then I have to go and research and like make sure to pay it proper respect, and but also creating like really cool imagery, and there's a lot of elements of it that we didn't mean to, but kind of ended up having a parallel with current issues, and I think that's one of the cool things about sci-fi. I hadn't worked with it before, but there's a lot of timelessness to the subject matter, where like whatever you do, it just kind of ends up like as you work on it, like something happens, and you're like, oh wow, like this topic and this thing is like in the thing that I'm working on. I didn't mean for it to, but it just kind of like happens, and you have those little moments of just parallels.
Absolutely, and I know you have a day job. How have you been able to organize your time to do this and the other projects that are so important to you?
I don't know, just make the time for it. Just whenever you find a nook and cranny of time, just work on it. And
As a Latinx creator, do you feel a certain responsibility to be doing the work that you do in addition to being passionate about it?
I've actually never really looked at it that way. For me, it's just been very natural of like, this is what I like to do. I just always liked making art. And it was never like a predictable path that I had in mind. It just kind of organically happened. And I've just been kind of honestly doing what I want. And it's worked out so far. So I just think that whenever you just are yourself and create for that purpose, people will come to you being like, well, I identify with that. So it's more of an organic process.
Well, Juan Argil, gracias, thank you, and keep at it.
Yeah, thank you.
Are you ready?